Welcome to today's GNCC Espresso Live, held in partnership with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, focused on the 6th Annual Ontario Economic Report, a landmark research platform offering a unique perspective on the experience of businesses of all sizes across the province. The report is a data-driven, evidence-based document rooted in the Ontario Chamber Network's annual survey of its members. It is highlighting the unprecedented year that was 2021 and the unpredictability that lies ahead. Findings from the reports will help you, along with policymakers, develop a strategy for the province's long-term economic recovery and growth. This year's report reveals the hardest hit sectors were small businesses, those located in border regions, organizations led by women and people with disabilities, and businesses in the arts, accommodation, entertainment, and agricultural sectors. Regional disparities continue to plague Ontario's economy, and forecasts for 2022 suggest employment will recover to pre-pandemic levels for all regions, except Niagara region, Toronto, Hamilton, and some other ones across Ontario. My name is Mishka Balsam, and I will be the moderator for the next hour. And it is my great pleasure to be joined today by Ester, economic analyst at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, where she is responsible for performing quantitative analysis and economic research on various public policy issues. In addition to her work for the Ontario Economic Report, she is the chair of the Ontario Chamber's Infrastructure Council. Ester holds a Master of Arts degree in economics from the University of Toronto and a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics with a concentration in pure mathematics from King's University College at Western University. And with us today is also Claudia Dessanti, the Senior Manager of Policy at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, where she leads policy initiatives to support Ontario's business community. Claudia founded and co-chairs the OCC's Energy Policy Council, oversees the Ontario Economic Report, and leads work around environment, energy, regional economic development, data policy, housing, diversity, inclusion, and more. She also serves on the advisory board for Innovate Cities, where she provides input on evolving privacy issues. In previous roles, Claudia researched mortgage markets for National Bank Financial and measured social impact for Charity Intelligence. She has a master's degree from the University of Oxford and a BA from the University of Toronto. Claudia and Esther, I'm really pleased that you can be with us this morning. So thank you. This webinar is supported by one of our key business saving partner, Elevon Payment Solutions. The right payment solution can help grow your business, set you apart from competitors, and boost your brand. For over 25 years, they have helped businesses of every size provide fast and secure payments that help drive both revenue and customer satisfaction. If you would like more information, please check the link in the chat function. And here is a brief video from one of my colleagues, Beth Fletcher, about the program.
Thank you, Mishka, and welcome everyone. My name is Beth Fletcher, and I am a Membership Account Manager at the GNCC. I'm excited to announce to you that we have launched a new partnership with Elevon through the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. This partnership has been negotiated for our members on a national level, so Elevon is able to offer great rates and promises to meet or beat your current rates. They are also well known for their customer service, and there is no commitment or contract, so no harm in getting a quote. I'd be happy to help out with that. My colleague Savannah will share my contact information with you in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to assist. Thank you and enjoy today's Espresso Live.
Thank you very much, Beth. And you have all the details in the chat function. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of today's format, I'm going to pass the webinar over to Claudia and Esther for the first 25 to 30 minutes. They will provide an overview of the findings that they've had because of the surveys that they have conducted and give you some insight and highlights about the report. And then we have the Q&A session. And I wanted to in advance thank those of you who have provided us with some of the questions already in advance. So thank you for that. But for those of you who are also here and would like to ask them, there's a chat function that you can take advantage of, or if you utilize the raise the hand function, we know, and we'll bring you in live to ask the question directly. If I can ask you to maybe hold some of the live questions until about 11:30, then you don't have to be wonder about the question, because some of it might have gotten answered already. But please utilize those two functions, and we really are looking forward to having an interactive session. And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues at the OCC.
Thank you very much, Mishka. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here and excited for the discussion. I'll share my screen here with a few slides. And this is our 6th annual, as Mishka mentioned, Ontario Economic Report. This is what we will cover in the presentation. And just a note that there's a lot more detail within the report itself, which you can find on our website. You can link that in the chat as well. But we wanted to share a few highlights that we found interesting, and hopefully you will take something away that's helpful to you. I will begin by covering our business confidence survey with some highlights around business confidence, business growth, policy priorities, diverse business leaders, and employee health and well-being. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague Esther to walk you through the economic outlook, which includes some data on provincial economic indicators, labor market, supply chains, inflation, commercial and household outlooks, and some closer look at the regional outlook data. And we will put a spotlight on the Niagara region as much as we can throughout the presentation. So we'll start with the business confidence survey. And Mishka mentioned this is a survey that we do every year to gain some insights into the experiences and perspectives of Ontario's business community. This year we had over 1,500 organizations respond to our survey, and they represented a very broad range of industries, business characteristics, sizes, and regions across the province. That included 127 organizations from the Hamilton-Niagara Peninsula region. And one thing to keep in mind is that the survey was in field online between October 6th and November 19th. So this was, as we all know, just before Omicron. And unfortunately, the results were not asking specifically about Omicron, and we weren't capturing reactions to that variant specifically. But what they do is provide a very clear picture of where businesses are about 2 years into the pandemic. And hopefully that will give policymakers and our audience a sense of some of the challenges that lie ahead. So we'll start with some relatively good news about business confidence. In our survey, we found that 29% of Ontario businesses are confident in the provincial economic outlook. And I realize that sounds quite low, but to put this in context, last year it was 21%. And over the past 5 years, the average confidence has been 24%. So we're actually doing quite well this year in terms of the provincial outlook. That is kind of dampened in Hamilton, Niagara. You'll see here, I noted 22% are confident in the province's economic outlook. So there tends to be a little bit more pessimism within that region. And we noticed this last year as well. We don't know exactly why this is the case, but we know that the region relies quite heavily on cross-border activity, whether that's travel or trade and supply chains. And so, of course, that has been dampened by the pandemic. The second set of bars here shows you confidence in the organization's own outlook. So we find that 57% of businesses say they are confident in their own organizations, and that's up from 48% last year. Again, here in Hamilton, Niagara, it was a little bit lower, so 51% this year. Stepping back to the provincial results, the number one reason that businesses attributed to their confidence was the vaccination rate against COVID-19. So this tells us overall that businesses are seeing a light at the end of the tunnel in a way that they couldn't last year. And again, keep in mind that these data were collected before Omicron, so there was a lot of frustration more recently, and that may have dampened confidence. But I think it's encouraging that the vaccines are driving up confidence, because that's something that we can still count on as a way out of the crisis. Now, looking at the results more closely by sector, the most confident sector was transportation and warehousing. 43% of businesses in that sector are confident in Ontario's economic outlook, and that jumped up 17 percentage points from last year. So a big change here, and we can attribute this in part to the fact that there's been high demand for transportation, a lot of supply chain backlogs that actually let the sector set prices effectively, and we'll get into those supply chain issues in a moment. But they have had a lot of demand this year. The next most confident sectors are government and finance and insurance. These sectors overall have been less negatively impacted by changes in consumer behavior and public health measures, so that makes sense as well. Now we take a closer look at businesses that are not confident, which is the majority. And we see that small businesses overall are less confident on average than larger ones. This has been true most years, so it's not unique to this year, but what we noticed is that the gap between small and large is much wider this year. So you can see here 48% of large businesses are explicitly not confident in Ontario's outlook, and 27% of small businesses are not confident. So that's a gap of 21 percentage points, and before the pandemic it was only 5 percentage point different. We can speculate as to why this is. I think we all understand that small businesses have faced a bit of a roller coaster over the past 2 years. They have had a harder time taking on more debt in order to manage the crisis. It's harder for them to pivot online generally because they don't have as many resources or systems in place to do that. And you may recall earlier waves of the lockdown measures disproportionately targeted smaller retailers while big box stores were able to stay open. So it's been very challenging for small businesses. Looking again at the results by sector, we can see specifically that confidence is lowest in the arts, entertainment, and recreation sector. Only 13% of businesses are confident there. Agriculture, forestry, and fishing, again, only 13%, and retail trade, 21%. These make sense intuitively. We know foot traffic has been well below pre-COVID levels in many of these sectors, particularly recreation and retail. And the reopening that began this week should help with that. But on the other hand, there are some deep-seated issues that are leading to some of the confidence issues here. Things like labor shortages, which Esther will discuss, inflation, supply chains again. Agriculture is certainly feeling the effects of all three of these, and they're also feeling the impacts of climate change and the impact that climate change is having on agricultural seasons and their ability to get goods to market because of damage to infrastructure. So some bigger challenges here that we need to watch out for. Last point on confidence, the Government of Ontario's response to COVID-19 was one of the main reasons for some businesses to feel confident, but on the other hand, some see it as the main reason for not feeling confident. So a lot of mixed reactions to the provincial government response to the pandemic. Now, similar to business confidence, we saw some improvements in business conditions this year. In 2020, we reported that 56% of organizations had shrunk, and this is what they reported to us. In 2021, this dropped to 38%. So we're seeing less shrinkage and a little more growth. And then we ask about what they expect to see in 2022. Of course, this is something we need to take with a grain of salt because we don't know what will happen. But an encouraging majority, 57%, expect that they will grow. So they're expecting to see a lot more progress this year with reopening and vaccines. I noted here that in Hamilton, Niagara, there's actually even more optimism in this sense. 61% expect to grow in 2022. And I think we can assume that the resumption of travel and cross-border trade will help the region significantly. Looking at sectors, again, here, no surprise, an outsized share of businesses shrank in the arts, entertainment, and recreation sectors. A whopping 78% say that they shrank this year, and accommodation and food services, 60%. By contrast, the sectors most likely to have grown include wholesale trade and labor. Labor would include, for example, unions. And moving on to policy priorities, what we do is we ask businesses what they would like to see governments prioritize over the next 12 months from a policy perspective. And the top 3 results we got this year were business taxes, electricity costs, and encouraging Ontarians to buy and travel locally. So the top 2 here are very focused on financial relief, and that's very understandable. Businesses are naturally worried about their balance sheets because they have a lot of debt. Many of them are grappling with the fact that support programs are going to be wound down very soon, and they're going to have to repay a lot of that debt. What's interesting is that small businesses have very different priorities from larger ones. So again, something to watch out for. We noted that small businesses are much more focused on cost measures. So not just business taxes, but also commercial rent relief, access to capital, and some of those measures that they see immediately as priorities to get them through the next few months. On the other hand, larger businesses were more focused on longer term issues like infrastructure investments and workforce development opportunities and regulatory modernization. So there's a dichotomy there, and it's going to be very important for governments to balance the short term relief with the longer term investments to support economic recovery. Both of those things are equally important, but we'll be watching out for how they strike that balance in the budgets. Now, something different that we did this year was to ask organizations about whether their leadership reflected any of these diverse demographics. And it was encouraging to see many organizations have quite a diverse representation within their leadership. It did yield some interesting results in terms of confidence. We noted that businesses led by women and or people with disabilities tend to be less confident on average, so 52% and 54% respectively. You may be wondering if this is because maybe they are smaller or they're concentrated in particular sectors. But what's interesting is that these factors didn't seem to account for the lower confidence entirely in our data. So there is something perhaps about the individuals that is a challenge for them in the business community. Meanwhile, on a more encouraging note, we see that businesses led by Indigenous persons and members of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community are more confident on average. So that is good to see. We also find that businesses led by diverse Ontarians are more likely to put more emphasis on societal issues. So for example, they're more likely to have a strategy for employee health and well-being, more likely to have a strategy for diversity and inclusion, and they're more likely to see climate change as a threat to their communities. So they seem to be more focused on social issues, and we think that these findings reinforce the idea that a diverse business community is better for the economy overall. Now, one last slide here on the survey. We wanted to put a spotlight on the well-being of employees. It's been a very challenging year for workers, for individuals, and employers alike. So mental health has been a big focus for us at the Chamber, and many have been calling attention to what's called the echo pandemic, or the impact that the pandemic has had on mental health. So this year we asked a few different questions related to well-being, and we found that the vast majority of organizations value employee health and well-being, but fewer organizations have a formal strategy in place to address it. So specifically, we saw 89% of businesses say that their success depends on their employees' health and well-being. Only 48% have a formal strategy, and something very similar happening here with diversity and inclusion. 62% said that they value diversity as a competitive advantage, but only 39% have some sort of diversity training or similar programs in place. There's a gap here between awareness and action, if you will. But I will say that a lot of this is driven by small businesses. So they are much less likely to have formal strategies. And that's understandable. It takes resources and time to develop these things. And it may not be as relevant to all of them. If they are a 5-person small business, they may not need a formal strategy, but something definitely for government to support them with. So that concludes the survey portion, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Esther to walk you through the economic outlook.
Thanks, Claudia. So to start, I'd like to start with a chart of economic indicators. This was kindly provided to us by BMO Bank of Montreal, and it outlines some of the key economic indicators for the province of Ontario. As you can see from the data here, Ontario's economy witnessed a record decline in economic output of 5.1% during the first year of the pandemic. And the province did begin to see some positive momentum last year, where real GDP rebounded by 4.2%. And this was driven a lot by growth in employment, household consumption, and exports, especially as vaccination rates increased, case counts declined, and restrictions were eased. But in the fourth quarter, a new round of public health measures introduced in response to Omicron renewed uncertainty and amplified challenges for the economy. So some of the risk factors that we anticipate for the year ahead include labor market challenges, supply chain disruptions, and inflationary pressures. And I'm going to get into a little bit of each one in the following slides. So next, I'd like to talk more in depth about the labor market challenges. The labor market has witnessed issues with both long-term unemployment and a high job vacancy rate. Our analysis of StatsCan data found that long-term unemployment has not yet recovered to pre-pandemic levels. And in December of last year, 28% of all unemployed individuals were long-term, compared to only 14% in the same month, 2019. One insight that I personally found quite alarming was the increase in job vacancies for the accommodation and food services industry, which grew to 13% in the third quarter of last year. And to put this into context, this is drastically higher than the 4.3% vacancy rate we saw pre-pandemic. This year's business confidence survey also revealed that 62% of all sectors are facing labor shortages, and another 62% expect to continue facing them over the next year. The next risk factor we identify is on supply chains. And this has quickly become a pressing issue for all sectors and segments of the economy. By now, I'm sure most of us have encountered some form of supply chain delay or disruption. And this could be from finally getting that couch that you ordered 6 months ago to trying to land the coveted PS5 for a loved one. But this is a global issue, and it's severely impacting the ability of many businesses to perform optimally and to keep up with the surges in demand and to ensure adequate inventory. The sudden surge in household spending during reopening last year pushed production into overdrive, and it quickly exposed infrastructure gaps and logistical inefficiencies along supply chains. And so the long anticipated rebound of economic activity expected from pent-up demand was largely hindered by these disruptions. Now, part of the issue does lie with Canada's trucking industry, which is currently facing a shortage of around 20,000 drivers. In addition to that, the global race to secure raw materials and manufactured goods has also pushed transportation costs to record levels. So as an example, I want to point out the shocking increase seen between March and July of last year for the cost of shipping a container, for the average cost of shipping a container from Europe to North America. And this jumped by nearly 80%. And adding to this mix is the rise in demand for e-commerce and same-day delivery services, as many Ontarians work from home, and it contributes to last mile congestion and driver shortages. The next and final risk factor outlined in the report is inflation. It's almost impossible for everyone here not to have felt the pinch of inflation in the past few months. As some might recall, we began seeing prices jump for things like lumber and construction materials as the housing market soared. Pent-up demand coupled with raw materials shortages, in addition to labor shortages and supply chain issues, have produced a strong cocktail of supply and demand-driven inflationary pressures. The graph here does a very good job at illustrating this upward trend seen across various consumer and producer-level price indices. And the vertical dotted line points out when the pandemic began back in March 2020. So we can expect to continue seeing inflation in the year ahead, but anticipated interest rate hikes might help bring down inflation to within target in 2023. Ultimately, this year's economic story lies with businesses and households. So let's first take a look at the business segment of the economy. While the anticipated interest rate hike may help cool demand-driven inflationary pressures, they may also have a negative impact on business investment. Although business investment in Ontario did see a decline of 6% during the quarter of last year, strong consumer spending in 2022, thanks to household savings and reopening plans, may once again incentivize businesses to boost their investments. So one finding that I hope all listeners keep in mind from today's event is that many of the hardest hit businesses will likely continue to face significant challenges as temporary support measures are phased out and as loans begin to mature. According to the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions, 36% of Ontario businesses expressed that the end of government supports would impact their survival in the coming year. So as interest rates change, it will be important for both monetary and fiscal policies to be mindful of the financial position of businesses most impacted by COVID-19. Now let's take a closer look at households. Q3 of 2021 saw household consumption rise by 5%, coupled with a strong savings rate, and both figures are expected to remain above pre-pandemic levels in the year ahead. Unsurprisingly, one of the main outlets for household disposable income last year was the housing market. Ontario's year-over-year housing price growth remained high and above 30%, with the GTA surging ahead at 24% year-over-year. Lastly, this bar chart helps illustrate some of the regional employment trends seen throughout the pandemic. In the first year of the pandemic, you can see that no region of Ontario was spared from the recessionary effects of COVID-19. So this meant significant drops in employment for all regions, but especially for the Windsor-Sarnia region, which declined the most at 11.1%, followed by Northwestern Ontario and Kingston-Pembroke regions. And you can see this by looking at the brown colored bars on the slide. Even with the moderate rebound seen last year, employment growth has yet to fully offset these initial declines that we saw. London was the only region to see positive employment growth in 2020. Last year, the region saw one of the biggest employment increases at 7.9%, following the addition of more than 16,000 jobs throughout 2021, and it's expected to continue growing in the year ahead. The highest increases in unemployment or joblessness in 2020 were seen in Toronto, Kitchener-Waterloo, Barrie, Hamilton, Niagara Peninsula, and Windsor-Sarnia, and recovery has been slow for these regions. Forecasts for 2022 suggest that the jobless rate will not fully recover to pre-pandemic levels in Toronto, Hamilton, Niagara Peninsula, London, Windsor-Sarnia, and Northwestern Ontario. And you can kind of see that from the different bars here on this slide. One trend that has caught our attention and is worth monitoring is the recent exodus of residents from the GTA to surrounding regions and provinces, which is largely due to remote working arrangements and high housing prices. Last year, Toronto's population grew by only 1.2%, and forecasts still indicate dampened population growth, though this is likely to see improvements as immigration strengthens and adds to the city's population. So that's all from me for now. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Claudia.
Thank you, Esther. And one thing that we really like about our report this year, if we may say so ourselves, is the interactivity of it. So if you want to dig into these findings a little more, you'll see a lot more data by sector and region in the appendices, and we've tried to give you as much of that as possible. If you do have other questions about some of the data and you want more analysis on it, we can definitely do that, so please do reach out. Just one last slide here to tie everything together. We wanted to note some takeaways that, provide a narrative for all of the different findings that we have. So the first one is the good news, which is that Ontario's economy grew in 2021. We showed you how real GDP, employment, business confidence, they're all trending upwards in most regions. And that's very encouraging to see, especially with vaccines driving most of these up. However, our outlook is dampened by three main structural issues: labor shortages, supply chains, and inflation that Esther discussed. And these are global issues for the most part. The result, again, as Esther mentioned, is that pent-up demand is not translating into the growth that it could be. And the impact of this on consumers is concerning. We note that Ontarians are seeing impacts on everything from the cost of living to the availability of services and products. They often will hear that businesses just don't have the staff to provide the customer service that they were before the pandemic. And the issues of affordability are having a big impact on the competitiveness of our province, which of course affects businesses. Even the housing points that Esther was discussing, it's important for businesses to be able to reach workers and talent. And if they can't live in a community because housing is too expensive, then this has a ripple effect throughout the economy. And then the last point here is that Ontario needs a long-term plan. The past 2 years, I think we can all agree, have been filled with a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of that was outside of government's control. But there is more that we feel governments could do to provide that stability to both businesses and households. And part of that is just creating a plan to manage future waves of the pandemic, making sure that there's transparency around what that future looks like and what economic recovery will look like. There's an election coming soon, and we all know that election cycles are short, but governments really do need to provide a stable environment because that is what confidence for both businesses and households is tied to. So that wraps up our presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Mishka, and we are very excited to answer any questions you guys have.
Claudia and Esther, and to all of your colleagues at the Ontario Chamber, thank you so very much for the report. I think it gives us a tremendous amount of insight and direction on what should be our priorities as we're moving forward. And businesses at all times really do appreciate data-driven reports, because it also helps them in looking at planning their next 3 to 5 years. Businesses don't like uncertainty, so this gives them a little bit of a roadmap of what possibly to expect to and what the current situation looks like. We have gotten a high number of questions that have already been coming in, and they're focused on everything from the labor market that you had touched based on. Business confidence is another one, housing market, inflation are some of them, but also specifically about the employee health and well-being, which is a new aspect of the study and the report that you have brought forward. So I thought for today's purpose, I'm encouraging every one of our participants to either raise your hand or utilize the chat function if you have a specific question. But here are some of the ones that I think are coming forward and that have come forward from a number of individuals. And this one is looking at the labor shortage, which has been identified by many people as being really one of the most key issues that businesses are dealing with. They're facing a huge labor shortage, as your research has shown. And we held in the fall of last year, we held our NAGA Economic Summit, and some of the economists who actually spoke to this issue too and said and actually indicated that this is likely going to stay here for a number of years. So this is not something that is only a short-term reflection due to the pandemic, but it's something that likely we have to deal with for 10 years or possibly longer. Is there anything that you have found that can help businesses find labor on an individual level, especially things that you maybe looked at in your data and looked at and saying, like, is our business going to be therefore faced with an increased cost of labor? Are there options or opportunities for businesses when looking at that data to overcome or address some of those shortages that they have? And what are some of the things that we need to ask of our government to make sure that we possibly close that gap of the shortage that we're experiencing?
So I think I can answer the question, and then Claudia, if you want to add. So we don't really get too much into this in the report itself, but we've certainly been considering some of the policy tools that the government could leverage in terms of addressing this issue. So one of the policy tools that we think would be really helpful, and as many might suspect, would be to increase immigration and to ensure that it's meaningful. So we find labor supply that will actually be addressing existing labor shortages within certain sectors and within certain industries. It'll also be important to explore other tools and support measures that encourage talent attraction and retention. So these could include things like, just as examples, learning credits and skills development opportunities, benefits, mental health supports. As we know, mental health has become a very big issue throughout, the world, in fact. And so just finding ways that we could support employees to make sure that they are healthy and stay within the workforce. Another point would be better collaboration potentially between trade schools, colleges, even universities with the private sector. So looking to create early learning opportunities and placements. We find that in our consultations with other members through the OCC that a lot of students don't actually know that there's certain jobs that exist. And that also leads to labor demand and labor supply issues. So finding ways to get the students into the workplace early, and also facilitating conversations between the private sector and the education community in terms of what types of skills we need now and what types of skills the future workplace is going to need. And now that we've all kind of been working from home, many of us have been working from home, it's important to also keep that in mind at an individual level. And how can we support employees that might want to be working from a different place, that might not necessarily be working in the same community or in the same city? And this leads to questions of how can we support tech adoption and as well as improve broadband. So being more flexible will also allow employers to find or to access a bigger pool of candidates. And finally, I just want to add another point on ensuring that there's adequate PPE, testing, and ventilation. So these three things are going to be critical as we move forward. And just ensuring that every workplace has these will help attract talent and keep talent, because obviously COVID is still going to be around for a while, and we just want to make sure that we've got safe workplaces. So those are some points that I have. Not sure, Claudia, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's great. And just to add kind of more broadly, the next generation of talent is looking for different things than maybe the previous ones. They're not just looking at compensation. They're asking for an employer that they identify with from a values perspective. Sometimes they're looking for just, support from a well-being perspective. So the expectations are changing and employers need to keep up with that too. So looking at the full package of what you're offering your employees, and that will vary by sector. Not every business can offer remote working to their employees. If it's a face-to-face business, then you might need to be there, but making sure that they're equipped with PPE, and that they have their uniform. And, you know, we've heard sometimes just the uniforms that are provided to staff are one size fits all. And if you're a smaller woman, then that just discourages you from working there. So it's small things that you can do, and not all of them have a cost. Some of it is just providing that support as an employer. But certainly you need to look at whether your staff feel supported, because they have so many options now. It's really an employee-driven market.
Thank you both, actually, for your response. We do agree, Esther, with some of the suggestions that you've made. Broadband, especially in communities and regions like Naga, is critical to people's ability to be more flexible to work where they want to work and where they prefer to work. And it's critical for employers to attract the labor force that they're looking for. And Claudia, you're making an excellent point when you talk about actually, and it probably links to employees' health and well-being. And employers in your study show that it's a concern for many employers. I think 89% of them indicate that their own success depends on their team and the individuals that they have around them. But a lot of them also don't have the tools and the knowledge on how to tackle it. And I think there's somewhere a report that I read that companies with less than 100 employees, which is the majority of Niagara, Hamilton, and the majority of Canadian companies have less than 100 employees. They often don't have a dedicated HR individual and experts on their team. It seems like at 100 employees of 100 or more, this seems to be kind of the barrier that exists. What are some of the other good resources that employers who are committed to improving the well-being of their staff, are there good resources that people could access, or that maybe we can lead them to and can share so that their expertise increases and that possibly their offering changes as well?
I'm glad you asked, and I'll answer this first and then let Esther fill in the gaps here. The OCC has been watching this, and we published a mental health toolkit earlier this year in October. I'll put the link in the chat in just a moment. We've been noticing that there's a lot more free resources offered by not just the government, but companies like Sun Life, insurance companies. They see that small businesses don't have that capacity, so they're offering those free resources, but it does take a bit of work to find them. So what we did is we compiled them into basically a table of resources. You can just click the links. Most of them are free. And, you know, it's important for businesses to be thinking about small things that they can do, because it doesn't have to be a 60-page document of things that you offer. It can be just saying, I know that my employees struggle with childcare, and here's a resource that is provided by a third party, and I'll just help connect them so that they know that I care and that I'm thinking about what they might need outside of work. So I'll just drop the link to that, and you can see if you scroll down into, I think it's part 4, there's a bunch of different free resources. And I think the amount of resources, oh, sorry, I sent it to one individual. The amount of free resources that are available will continue to increase, because this is not a challenge that's going away. And it's great that the awareness is increasing. And I think that will lead to just more progress.
And Claudia, on that note, actually, you made a reference to actually, it seems often like a simple aspect, but it's a very complex one, and that's childcare. We're looking at Quebec's numbers, who have a much more robust childcare program in place, and we see 80% of women who have school-age kids being still employed and actively in the marketplace, compared with Ontario, only 70%. And then coming back to our labor shortage that we are experiencing, that we're currently in, what role does childcare and possibly the federal childcare plan play in actually reducing some of that labor shortage that we're facing?
The short answer is that it's a huge driver of what we're seeing with the exiting from the labor market permanently. So in the early stages of the pandemic, we saw that women lost a significant greater number of jobs than men, because they had to stay home with their kids. Schools were closed, daycares were closed. And some of that picked back up once the pandemic evolved and schools were able to open and people figured out what to do. But what the data doesn't show is, or at least the number of jobs doesn't show, the number of women who left the labor market permanently. And that's contributing to the labor shortage. And these are often people who are employed in those specifically food and accommodation sectors that tends to be disproportionately women. So a lot of those women are not coming back, because they just, the longer you stay out, the longer you'll be out. So if Ontario doesn't sign the childcare deal, then we're looking at long-term impacts that can't easily be quantified by the number of women we see out today. It's going to affect the choices that women make down the line. We're really pushing for them to sign that deal soon.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting. We have within our chamber a number of advisory councils giving us feedback on key policies and initiatives that are critical to them. Two of them, one of them is the Women in Niagara, Women in Business Council, and the other one is Next Niagara. This is really looking at the millennials, people that are 35 to 40 and younger, and the challenges they have. And both councils very, very strongly also support of the childcare and the needs that they're facing when it comes to that. I wanted to shift a little bit because there's a couple of questions that have come forward when we look at the regions. And often in Niagara, we're small, well, we're not by land size as much, but by population, we're a smaller region that is there. And we often look at comparing ourselves. How do we compare against some other regions? Are people, are businesses in the Hamilton Niagara region more optimistic, more positive, more pessimistic about the economic outlook? What does it look like, and what could be some of those drivers that might have created that kind of perception or those kind of feelings within the business community? And I'm not sure, it's either Claudia or Esther, either one of you, whoever would like to take it.
Esther, I'll let you go first.
Sure. So as mentioned earlier, we know that the Hamilton Niagara Peninsula region was among those that saw some of the highest increases in unemployment, or the jobless rate, beginning in 2020. And this was at 8.7%. And since then, recovery has been quite slow. So definitely this would be, I believe, one factor that could be playing into it, the fact that, you know, they're still dealing with a lot of employment issues. And most of this is due to the impact that COVID has had on the arts, entertainment, recreation, retail, trade, food, and accommodation industries, which are all important industries for this regional economy. On the plus side, the region is expected to see strong employment gains in the year ahead at 5.6% as the economy opens, as tourism begins to pick back up, and as border restrictions are eased. But until that time, the slow recovery in unemployment might be one of the reasons for pessimism, at least for the time being. So not sure, Claudia, if you wanted to add anything from the business confidence survey that you've noticed.
I would agree with that. We can only speculate, right? Especially for confidence, it's a subjective measure, so I wouldn't read too much into it. But certainly on the employment growth side, it's likely the border, and we'll see, I guess, this year whether that picks back up and that improves the picture. It can also be, you know, we saw in London, for example, a single employer can have a big impact on the region. So that can change over time. If there's an effort to attract a large anchor institution in Niagara, in Hamilton, then that can have a big impact on employment and then on confidence. So it's really hard to predict, but certainly has seen a little bit more pessimism in that region.
Can I, there's a couple of attendees who have brought up the question, and maybe it links to what we were just talking about, and this is looking at the housing market. Home prices in Ontario went up almost 20% in 2021, and the average is now just under $900,000. Similar increases in 2020. And we are expecting another and projecting another increase for 2022. But this is not just a big city problem. In Niagara, for example, the average residential price has gone from $400,000 in 2019 to over $700,000 by 2021, while the median household income for a Niagara resident earns is just around $63,000 before taxes. This means that the average house in Niagara costs over 3 times what the average households in Niagara can actually afford. And the rental market and the rental cost doesn't look much better there either. What impact does this housing market have, and what are the opportunities that we have in Niagara and Ontario to really address this as seriously and with lots of courage and will to make a difference there?
It's a great question. I can say that we have never heard housing said so oftenly from the business community as we are now. It's usually it was seen as a social issue, or it was seen as a socioeconomic question, but now it really is tied to businesses' ability to attract and retain their workers. So it's having a direct impact on the economy, and it's concerning even just thinking about the next generation not having that opportunity. I think on a local level, the challenge really is density, and there are restrictions in place in most communities that prevent, second units or laneway housing, gentle density, mixed housing. There are regulations there that need to change, and I think it needs to be done in a sensitive way to those communities, because there are genuine concerns for why people are resisting more density, and those need to be addressed. It can't just be there's a lot of talk of ministerial zoning orders that would just override that ability and get the job done quicker. But there are communities that have legitimate concerns, and they need to be part of the process. But part of it really just is that there's a resistance to more density, and that is supply and demand, right? There's a limited supply, and there's a lot more people coming into these regions, and we have to confront that fact. We also need to be building around transit stations, because it's not just density for density's sake, but making sure that those people are connected, because it takes me 45 minutes to get to work, but if I just live 10 minutes off the side, then I have to walk another 45 minutes to get to the bus. Like, it makes a huge difference where these houses are. So we need to be thinking about community planning more broadly. And Esther, feel free to add.
I think you covered the main points there, but definitely, as we've seen with out-migration trends, a lot of people are coming from potentially higher income areas and moving into these sort of surrounding regions. So probably this will start to dampen as interest rates increase, but it's hard to tell, even with the recent announcement that interest rates are expected to increase. It led to a surge in housing purchases, because everyone is worried about, oh, I need to make sure I buy this house at a lower interest rate now while I can. So there's going to be a small explosion, but I'm sure future interest rate hikes are going to start to soften that a bit. At least that's the hope.
Mm-hmm. This is it's such an interesting discussion, because Naga has been identified, the Naga region has been identified as being one of the key regions across Ontario, as being a growth in population region that is there. And then we at the same time take into consideration, so what are the employment opportunities? Are they growing at the same rate? And what impact and what pressure does it put on the housing market? And this issue comes up all the time. And Claudia, back to your point and beforehand, it would used to be looked at as more of a social issue. It's the same as childcare. It was never actually so directly linked to the economic recovery, economic growth, and economic well-being actually of a region. And now it is, which is probably it's in its right place. I wanted to come back to a couple of things that were mentioned that had to do with the inflation. One of your slides looked at the risk factors of inflation. How do you see inflation affecting wages and labor shortage again? And I know that you have touched on it, but we are getting a couple of questions on this topic. And I was wondering if it's really kind of good to look at that, because are we mainly also dealing with a pent-up consumer demand and maybe shortages of goods that is driving this, or is this really here to stay, and how will it impact individuals? That was a very broad question. I'm so sorry, because I'm looking at the individuals and I'm looking at them from a business point of view, but they are so closely linked together. So Esther, thank you for answering it.
Yeah, for sure. So we do mention this briefly in the report as well, but what we've noticed so far is that inflation hasn't created widespread wage growth, and that's likely because, there's still the belief that inflation is temporary, especially as supply chain bottlenecks are expected to eventually resolve in the coming year or 2 years, as labor supply begins to pick up with immigration and international students coming back. What will be important, though, to watch for is whether price increases will be permanent for food and things like groceries in general, which could impact wages in the medium to long term. So there's definitely a concern on some fronts about inflation lasting, and this could put pressure on wages, but hard to tell right now. At least what we've seen so far is that wages have gone up for certain sectors more than others, especially in high contact service industries. But all in all, this is a smaller part of the bigger problem, which is wage pressures are more likely to exist in industries that have been the most impacted by the pandemic. And so these businesses may not be able to afford offering higher wages as a means for filling job vacancies. So if you think about restaurants that are having challenges filling, job postings, they've got to think about, okay, how do we attract talent? How do we keep them here? Let's try and offer them higher wages, but how? Because they are currently the ones who've had to deal with some of the most difficult impacts from COVID-19 with all the lockdowns and shifts in consumption trends. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's excellent. I was wondering if we could shift a little bit over to economic recovery. So for the last 2 years, we have seen at a federal level, a provincial level, a high number of programs very successful for businesses like SIBA, SERB, and other ones, indicating there might be room for a more active public sector role in stimulating the economy even after COVID. Yet at the same time, there's a lot of business and organizations who are saying it needs to be business-led. We can't add more debt to all levels of governance. We need to really address this differently. And so there are different thoughts about this. Should there be more programs in place, or how do we encourage and make sure that it's a more business-led economic recovery? And I was wondering if you could speak to that approach, one versus the other, or how to best move forward from here. Claudia?
I think you hit the nail on the head in how you framed it, that there's both a recognition that without these supports, the crisis would have looked very different for businesses and for workers, and they played an incredibly important role in bridging the divide and sort of a lifeline to make people get through this. On the other hand, there's that concern about the public debt and government overstepping and competing with the free market as well. We don't want subsidies that prevent the market from working as it should. So there's a bit of a challenge there. I think that from our survey, one thing that we didn't cover in the presentation was the government support programs. We asked businesses, have you accessed this program? We gave them a list, and did you find it helpful? And the programs that were most helpful were the wage subsidy and the business loans. And both of those are temporary programs in nature. They're meant to really address a very pandemic specific situation. So we can expect that those will be phased out and won't be necessary in the future. But the larger question is really interesting. And I think that a lot of businesses have changed their view a little bit on the role that government might play. We've heard this within our membership as well. Certainly there's no appetite for government to be just subsidizing all businesses for no particular reason, but in a time of crisis or in a particular sector where there's a risk of a wave of closures and it's going to impact jobs and survival, then there is a role for government to play. And I think the lesson that we would take away is that it needs to be very targeted. So throughout the pandemic, they've come out with these support programs and then have been very good at revising the design and the structure of the program based on feedback. Both governments, the provincial and federal, have done a lot of revisions of how they structure these programs. And the lesson really has been that the way that you target the program to those that need it the most has the most important factor in deciding how useful it is. So the COVID-19 app, for example, the alert app that we all downloaded on our phones, that was the least helpful according to our survey. And I think it's just because it wasn't targeted towards a particular sector. It was more of a community general support initiative. And on the other hand, things like the SIBA loans or the small business support grant at the provincial level, very helpful because they were addressing a very particular need. And Esther, I know you've got tons of thoughts on this as well, based on your analysis.
I wouldn't say tons of thoughts, but a few. I do think what we're noticing is that it's a little too early to tell just exactly how efficient and effective these programs have been. We know with the recent Auditor General's report, as well as some of the recent FAO expenditure monitor reports, a lot of them are indicating that we need to see exactly how these programs were used, who used them, how much funding was actually helpful, whether there were businesses that didn't need them and still got the funding. So there's definitely room for improvement, but the case can be made that for future crises, this is something we can fall back on and perhaps consider as a way of driving economic recovery or generating economic activity. So it's definitely something that we can consider, I think, the next time a crisis comes around. But at the very least, I think, personally, I hope that the communication aspect of all of this is here to stay. We've seen with the pandemic, there's been a lot more communication between the public and the private sectors. And I personally think this has been a good thing. And I think that's the one thing that should definitely be permanent.
I actually agree with you on that last point that you made, Esther. It's that really we are understanding that we actually are working together actually on this one. Has been probably overused, that term, but I think we really do depend on it. We've never had more businesses at a local level being interested and looking at policies, subsidies, grants, advocating for certain ones than we have seen over the last 2 years. A real understanding and realization how much we depend on one another for moving us socially and economically forward. I'm conscious of the time because we have about 5 minutes left, and there's one particular question, and I'm going to get to it in a second, that has to do with mental well-being again. But there's one question, and just in light of the conversation that we had, and it has to do with electricity costs, that many businesses still identify as being a major issue, but we've only seen a temporary rate reduction over the course of the pandemic. Do you think that there can be a permanent cuts to electricity rates, and is that advisable from an environmental perspective? And I'm probably only going to give you a minute or 2 minutes to answer this one, but Claudia, if I could ask you to take that would be great.
I'll try to be quick, but this is my favorite topic, so it's hard. Some of you may recall that Doug Ford had promised a 12% rate reduction in his campaign, and that proved to be very challenging for a few different reasons. We have an electricity system where most of the costs are fixed, so the most that he can really do, or that the government can do, is to shift those costs. He did cancel a bunch of contracts through the Green Energy Act, and that made a dent, but it didn't have actually that big of an impact, and it did have an impact on the supply of clean energy. So there's a trade-off there. Most of what they've done through the past 3 years has been to shift costs from the rate base onto the tax base, which just means that taxpayers are on the hook for it. So it's proven to be very difficult. And what we're facing heading into the next decade is a huge energy shortfall. So there's going to be a capacity gap, and we need investments in clean energy to fill that. That's going to be expensive. It means that what the government needs to do from our perspective now is develop a long-term energy plan that factors in affordability. Because if we don't have a plan today, then those investments are going to be more expensive. There's more risk for an energy generator to make investments under uncertainty, right? So if they know what the plan is today, then they're going to attract low-cost capital, and we need to balance affordability with sustainability, because businesses are looking for clean energy to meet their net zero targets, but affordability is going to require a plan.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. There's a question that has come in from Fatal, and this is bringing us back to employees' overall well-being that's there, and they agree that the best and the greatest resource that any company has are actually the people. We can only second that. What other government resources can you recommend to small business owners? As a small business, they want to hire and train people, but they cannot afford to pay them adequately or above market to retain them. Are there any specific resources that you might suggest that we can share with our audience?
Esther, I think you had a document that you could share here with some support programs. I'll just add, and we'll put that in the chat, I'll add that your financial institution that you have a relationship with probably has a lot of resources. We've heard from some of the credit unions and some of the banks as well that they have these small business support programs. It's hard for them to build awareness of them, but I think if you reach out to your branch manager, you'll find some support there. And then we've compiled this document recently that has COVID-19 related support programs from all levels of government. So if you want to take a look at that, there might be something relevant to you. There are lots of loans available. I know that loans aren't the perfect solution because more debt is difficult to pay back, but there are more and more grants, especially from the financial institutions, that may help.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Esther, for sharing it in the chat. We have about like a minute and a half or 2 minutes left. 30 seconds for closing comments. Maybe Esther, if I could ask you first and then over to Claudia.
I guess just off the top of my head, I think, we've been through a lot. The past 2 years have been very difficult and challenging for all segments of the economy in one way or another. I think, with the recent wave of Omicron, it's definitely dampened a lot of our hopes and kind of made it seem like we're never getting out of this. But I think the good thing is, we do have 2 years of experience under our belts now. I think we're ready to see economic recovery happen. We're hopeful for it. And with, reopening now and like future plans of reopening, I think we're in a better place than we were 2 years ago with how we manage this and how we face this crisis head on, even from an economic standpoint. So yes, it's a lot of doom and gloom, but there's hope yet. So I guess that's all my comments for now.
Thank you very much. And Claudia?
Just on that theme of collaboration, I would say it's great to have these conversations with the local chambers and with businesses, and whatever you can do to connect with the organizations in your community, it helps, because stronger together, right? All of this has been possible because of that collaboration and communication. So thank you, Mishka, for facilitating these conversations and for working with your members to make that happen.
Yeah, Claudia and Esther, thank you very much for being with us today. And I can only second that the chamber network is really much broader than just our chamber. We have a number of chambers throughout Niagara. We have a number of chambers, a high number of chambers, part of the Ontario Chamber throughout Ontario and Canada-wide. And that's the knowledge and feedback from all the businesses that are supporting the chamber that is really making the resources and these discussions actually possible. So thank you very much. Many of the resources that also were mentioned today are available on our website as well at gncc.ca. The report, overall, the economic report has been shared in the chat, but we'll also make sure to email it to you afterwards, as we really do appreciate that you're part of it. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us or to the Ontario Chamber, and we can direct you to either Claudia and Esther directly as well. So thank you very much. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be available afterwards as well. So thank you for that. And Esther and Claudia, as always, it's a pleasure to be working with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good weekend, everyone.
Bye-bye.